Okay. Okay, good morning, everybody. Thank you for being early birds. It's an early morning. So today, final culminating day of the Shapes of Time. So we are today served the ultimate cocktail, Shapes of Time cocktail, with people representing different intellectual fields, different artistic fields, talking about how time, the role that time plays in their respective fields and artistic pursuits, using time both as a method and medium. So we started assembling the team, the ultimate dream team of time shapers about a year ago with Morgan and Anthony. A lot of serendipity was at play. I met Aaron at the dinner party. Where's Aaron? Aaron at the dinner party with mutual friends. I think we spoke about John Dewey, and I said, "You are shaper of time. Can you come?" And Dipesh, I read a recent, I think, article by you about deep time, and I thought, if a post-colonial theorist goes deep time, that's positively weird. Time shaper. And Alice and Deacon, you were the kind of very last addition, because I was trying to find an architect, a shaper, time shaper architect. And unfortunately, there is not a dating app where you can just, go and say, okay, this is a site. But I narrowed the search, internet search, to Irish architects. Because I thought if you are an architect working in an island surrounded by ocean and Neolithic sites, if you don't think about time, you are a total moron. So soon I found my match. So that's how you ended up here. Otherwise, there's a lot of course, benevolent nepotism, friends and friends of friends, a former student, throw in a couple Finns, we have a good cocktail. So today we have 3 panels. We start with measures of time. After that, we break for lunch, and then there are 2 panels in the afternoon, histories of time and landscapes of time. David, Morgan, and Anthony will respectively moderate the panels and sum it all up. And by the end of the day, we can all shape time. But let me elaborate on the title of the symposium. It is borrowed from a 1960 book called The Shape of Time, which was written by the art historian George Kubler, a pioneer in the study of pre-Columbian art, who taught here at Yale History of Art Department from 1938 till his retirement in 1983. Unquestionably, the most important and influential piece of art historical scholarship of its era, this very thin 130-page long book was widely read in the 60s by artists like Lawrence Alloway, Robert Smithson, Ad Reinhardt, Michael Heitzer, and Donald Judd, as well as architects and students of architecture in the following decades. I think we have many, many readers. So I received my copy in 1995 from a dear friend and colleague, Alec Purvis, who is here in the audience, and his late wife, Rika. You can see the dedication here on the page. I did not understand the book at all. So, but I worked hard. So after 30 years, I think I nailed it. And it's only actually when after I wrote my own book about time, Untimely Moderns, and finished it last year, that I think I really now, I'm so close, but I still keep reading. It's a very worn out copy. So for me, actually, the concept untimeliness helped me decipher Kubler's thesis. As you all know, the term was coined by Shakespeare a long time ago. And then the term was reintroduced to 20th century thought by Friedrich Nietzsche, who translated it into the German word Unzeitgemäß. So un, against, Zeit, time, and gemäß, kind of appropriate. So it's kind of like not time appropriate. So very provocative term at the time when other historians were talking about things being of their time and timely. So this concept of untimeliness was super important for Nietzsche's historical schemata, where he argued that future was shaped by historical reflection. He writes beautifully about the value of historical studies. I mean, he asked the simple question that why should we bother somebody living today? Why should that person bother about history in the first place? So he writes beautifully about the value of classical studies as follows. He says, I do not know what meaning classical studies could have for our time if they were not untimely, that is, acting counter to our time and thereby acting on our time, and maybe one day to the benefit of the time to come. So this very strange idea of collapsing past, present, and future. Importantly, I think for all of us historians, Nietzsche was kind of a pioneer, thinking that the past should always be viewed from the perspective and for the benefit of the present. So you are not doing history for the benefit of historical knowledge, you do it for the benefit of the present, and it's kind of phenomenological in a way that you look at it from a perspective of your own space and time. So this, like I said, this concept untimeliness really helped me decipher Kubler. So Kubler famously declared, everything made now is either a replica or variant of something made little time ago, and so on, back without break to the first morning of human time. He was talking about artists, makers of artifacts. Baldessari, John Baldessari, a 60s artist, did a painting for him where he writes, this painting owes its existence to prior paintings. By liking this solution, you should not be blocked in your continued acceptance of prior inventions. To attain this position, ideas of former painting had to be rethought in order to transcend former work. To like this painting, you will have to understand prior work. Ultimately, this work will amalgate with the existing body of knowledge. So this meant also that every piece, every artifact was not to be thought of in isolation, but part of this longer transhistorical series, or what he called form class, that also span beyond the duration of anyone's individual life. So it's kind of like what Dipesh talked about yesterday, that human beings also, we have a duration, but in fact what's in our bodies, the cells and everything has much longer time span. So this meant also that in his mind, art or any artifact was only partially informed by its historical context. So this, of course, countered the idea of chronological time and the idea that object could be organized in distinct periods and dated and put into a timeline, which dominated his field of art history at that time. So notes that Kubler makes, so Kubler studied with this equally famous art historian Henry Faucillon, who taught here in the 30s and early 40s. And these are some notes that Kubler made in Faucillon's class around 1940. And I think this helped me also to figure out, like, how did he think about what distinguishes, what makes objects, or any object, art objects, different? Like, why do we have to think of them differently than some other historical facts? So he distinguishes two types of historical facts as follows. He says, both the New Deal and the Radio City are historical facts, but the former is a memory, like every historical fact, and demands reconstruction by aid of documents. But the latter is an object forever present, incorporating a creative force for as long as it is visible. Each generation brings its own new sensibility to the work of art created prior to its time. So very important distinction. We always rethink, revisit these past objects from our perspective and for the benefit of our time. So Kubler compares the world of objects. He really thought of all objects, not just art objects, as planets in a galaxy, kind of sending signals. Says it's all old light that we can see. They send signals through time and space. Right, these little diagrams. And he considered that these signals had ability to move at different speeds and intensities, sometimes yielding repetitions and copies, sometimes causing innovative leaps. Sometimes you find clusters of activity at some place or period, and sometimes non-activity. Sometimes signals sent by past objects end up in dead ends. So at the other end are we shaping time by interpreting, reworking, and further relaying these signals. So this is what he meant, I think, with the idea of shaping time. Because in his mind, time and history were not something static and given, but malleable or even reversible, and above all, nonlinear. So Kubler considered the right balance of continuity and change essential for the survival of societies. And he writes, without change, there is no history. Without regularity, there is no time. His pet peeve was the modernist architect, or the kind of, quintessential modernist architect. He names Walter Gropius as his main culprit, who in Kubler's words, quote, sought to invent everything they touched all over again in austere forms which seemed to owe nothing to past traditions. By rejecting history, the purist, he called them purist, defies the fullness of things. While restricting the traffic at the gates of perception, he denies the reality of duration. So it's perhaps no surprise or accident that this building, Art and Architecture building, later renamed by its architect Paul Rudolph, was completed only after 1 year after Kubler's book was published. To be sure, Rudolph shared Kubler's concern for the fallacy of linear history and historical amnesia it entailed. While often heralded as the poster child of 1960s brutalist architecture, this building entails numerous temporal layers. Not only did the building bear a formal resemblance to Frank Lloyd Wright's Larking building that had been torn down in 1950, but its concrete surface embodies and seems to suggest the act of inbuilt self-ruination. To add to this idea that the building can both recall time and expedite the passing of time, Rudolph sprinkled a series of plaster casts of ancient artifacts throughout the building, shells and other things as well. As Mari Lending, as one of our speakers today, recalls in her book, Plaster Monuments, the cast had originally been displayed at the art gallery until Joseph Albers required them to be stored in the basement after his arrival. Rudolph gave them a new life by dispersing them throughout the building in unpredictable places, above doorways and hallways, even in bathrooms, in a manner that ignored standard display practice of labels, taxonomies, chronologies of any kind. Importantly, here you see on the right Louis Sullivan's frieze from the Chicago Stock Exchange is located next to Pantheon Metopes on the 3rd floor next to the dean's office. In Mari's words, quote, Rudolph's mounting of the plaster cast was polychronic, not chronological, unquote. Walking up the main stairwell, over the span of few floors, we can encounter relief of Assyrian king and get an oblique view of a Gothic saint, while a seashell embedded into the concrete wall reminds us that our historical imaginations should not stop with antiquity, but extend all the way back to the deep time. So today's presenters in this room will be guarded. You can't see it, but I can see it. By these ionic flutes installed somewhat precariously on these thin metal poles, so watch out. And then in the back, there's a frieze from the Temple of Apollo from the British Museum, a copy. So we are surrounded by these time-shaping objects. Rudolph famously stated, "I don't give a damn about history. I only care about what I can use." This statement captures that neither an architect or a historian should not try to replicate the past, but rather reimagine, reinvent, and narrate the past again and again. So, with these words, David, come and take it.
Hello, good morning. I'm David Sadigian, an assistant professor of architectural history and theory here at the Yale School of Architecture. What's happening? Okay. So thank you for that wonderful introduction, Eeva-Liisa. I think it's a reminder to all of us that this symposium is not an isolated event. Rather, we're part of an ongoing dialogue with many interlocutors, both past and present, who have each posed questions and sought answers about the shapes of time. And this is a phenomenon that, of course, extends back many centuries and indeed many millennia. But a recent example can be found in Eeva-Liisa's brilliant new book, Untimely Moderns, published last year by Yale University Press, and this is an unpaid advertisement. So several of you know about this book, but for those of you who don't, it examines a kaleidoscope of figures who each explored concepts of nonlinear time here at Yale around mid-century. And these figures include architects such as Paul Rudolph, as we've heard about, but also artists and art historians, figures who all functioned in some way as sort of time travelers to revisit the historical past in order to shape their modern present. So our first panel for today is titled Measures of Time, and it carries forward this ambition. So by foregrounding the theme of measurement, this panel emphasizes the different devices, media, and notational systems used to register time, to quantify it, and to make it knowable through representation. The case studies presented this morning are thus in dialogue with the many amazing objects we saw yesterday at the Beinecke Library, for those of you who are able to join us. And indeed, today's speakers are not unlike the makers of those Babylonian cuneiform tablets, Mesoamerican codices, and early modern European printed books. Uniting those artifacts in this morning's case studies is an enduring concern. The question of how time might be measured through acts of surface inscription. In that vein, we will hear about techniques of conceptual photography, graphic notation, and experimental preservation practice. And I look forward to the shared dialogue we can all have by comparing the ways each of you think about time's measurement and inscription across media. So our first speaker this morning is Daniel Rosenberg, who's joining us today from the University of Oregon, where he is professor of history with an additional affiliation in the Department of Comparative Literature. Professor Rosenberg is an intellectual historian with a research focus on the history of information and information graphics. In addition, he writes on a wide range of topics related to historiography, epistemology, language, and visual culture. His books include Cartographies of Time, A History of the Timeline, which he co-authored with Anthony Grafton, and this is an indispensable resource for many of us in our syllabi, and Histories of the Future, which he co-edited with Susan Harding. Rosenberg is editor-at-large of Cabinet, a quarterly of art and culture, where he is a frequent contributor. He also directs a digital project on historical graphics supported by the National Endowment for the Humanities, entitled Time Online. He's also received grants and fellowships from the ACLS, the NEH, the Stanford Humanities Center, the Max Planck Institute for the History of Science, and the American Academy in Berlin, among other institutions. And his recognitions at the University of Oregon include the Coleman Guiteau Teaching Fellowship, the Fund for Faculty Excellence Award, the Lori Loki Award for Science and the Human Condition, among others. And he's also published on a wide range of topics, including Paleolithic calendars, the concept of sloth, the history of Jello, and the languages of planet Mars. We won't be hearing about Jello this morning, I believe. So please welcome Professor Rosenberg for his talk, The Dot and the Line, Visualizing Temporal Uncertainty.
I'm going to get organized. Can you hear me? Yep. Okay. Can I read in this light? That's a good question. Let's see. Good. Okay. It's great to be here. I mean, really, everything has been amazing. I have to say, as a historian, and yeah, that'd be great. Much better, thank you. As a historian and as an object nerd, my favorite thing so far has been the Beinecke. Everyone is great. Sometimes things are even better. But thank you, Eva, and thank you, everyone. This is not an apology, but an explanation. The title of the talk, The Dot and the Line, Uncertainty, and et cetera, is the title of the longer paper, but as my timer in my hotel room told me, I only have time for half of it. So you're going to hear more about lines than dots. The dots are great. And you'll hear more about algorithm than uncertainty. Uncertainty is great. So I encourage you, if you are hungry for uncertainty, to track me down later, and I will try to nourish you. This paper is part of a larger project about 18th century representations of time and uncertainty. It's related to the book that David mentioned, Cartographies of Time, where I'm, in this part of the project, in this new project, I'm interested in this moment in the 18th century when certain kinds of ideas and representations of time that we're very familiar with now, progressive linear representations of time, representations that get kind of a bad rap, are very new and fungible and experimental. And what I'm mostly trying to do in this project is to recapture the kind of experimental, uncertain quality of those ways of figuring, which by now are quite encrusted and feel often very limiting. So I hope to see the timeline, which Eva referenced, again, in a way that maybe brings out a little bit of the Nietzsche in it. So anyway, yeah, one more thing to say by way of introduction. So there's a kind of maker methodology at work in the project that I'm doing now. So with some colleagues at the Infographics Lab at the University of Oregon, what we've been doing, the two objects I'm mostly talking about today are 1765 Chart of Biography by Joseph Priestley and the 1769 New Chart of History. And what we're doing is we're building online versions of these old, interactive versions of these old artifacts. And the point of doing that work, it's got sort of two goals. One is to make these very extraordinary print artifacts, which are hard to access and hard to understand because they refer to names that people don't know and they use techniques that people aren't familiar with anymore. So partly it's to make this stuff accessible and comprehensible, and we're working on that. That's sort of the museum-y aspect of the project. But for me, the more significant part of the project is putting ourselves under strictures that Priestley himself felt in the 18th century when he took narrative historical works and extracted data from them and re-displayed it, reconfigured it in a visual format. He had to invent the visual format, and he also had to invent the rules of data processing to turn narrative into this static visual representation. And so the gambit here is to take a new representational form, which is this kind of interactive graphics, and to do the same thing, to take Priestley's work and to reimagine it in the regime of these rules and to see what can be learned from it. And I have a lot more to say about that won't fit in the paper. This is really just an introduction, but we'll have time to talk in the panel and at lunch. So I'll go quickly, but I think this will be fun. Okay. So the image you're looking at is a copy of Joseph Priestley's 1765 Chart of Biography. I suspect many of you have seen this image before. It's one of the most important diagrams in the history of infographics in general, and a crucial waypoint in the history of chronographics specifically. Before Priestley, almost no one used a straight, measured line to represent historical time. After Priestley, it became so common as to be unremarkable. That's us. The evidence of this transition is clear, yet it barely seems possible. I mean, from a technical perspective, there's almost nothing to Priestley's chart beyond the fact that it measures time the way that Priestley's contemporaries unreflexively measured space. And yet in 1765, it really was new. I expect that from where you sit, the words on Priestley's big chart are much too small to read, so let me just show you this detail and clarify what's going on to give you a foothold. As its title suggests, Priestley's chart is a chart of names. He's chosen about 2,500 names from 3,000 years of history. Along the top and the bottom of the chart are lines measured out in intervals of 100 years. The chart's horizontal rows are there to sort out different kinds of biographical achievement. There's a row for scientists, a row for artists, a row for politicians and generals, and so forth. And in the chart, all of those little horizontal lines, which you see blown up here, those are lifelines. Each one is tagged with a name. Where there's uncertainty, Priestley uses dots instead of or in addition to a solid line. Now, in this smaller chart that Priestley made to demonstrate how the main chart works, you can see at a glance who died young, who lived a long life, who came earlier and later, and whose lives overlapped. You can see patterns to rhythms of development and succession. Compare this to the complexity of expressing these same relationships and patterns, especially patterns in words, and you can understand why Priestley's contemporaries were so taken by his example. This is what Priestley says in a little book he published along with the chart. Let me desire the reader, for his satisfaction, to make an experiment of the use of the chart by means of no more than 5 names in the specimen annexed. Specimen. For example, Pindar, Sophocles, Xenophon, Plato, and Terence. Let him attend only to his own ideas, those carefully as possible, while he reads that Pindar died 435 years before Christ, aged 86. Sophocles died 406, aged 91. Xenophon died 359, aged about 90. Plato died 348, aged 81. And Terence died 159, aged 35. Is it now easy, from these numbers, and all of the mechanical assistance to which a person's mind is habituated and can have resource, to form a clear idea of how those lives stand related to one another in the whole length of them? Can you even tell without an arithmetical computation whether Plato or Xenophon were born first, though some number of years intervened betwixt them? Please now to inspect the chart, and as soon as you have found the names, you see at one glance, without the help of arithmetic or even words, and in the most clear and perfect manner possible, the relationship of those lives to one another in any period of the whole course of them. And I think it's really actually a remarkable demonstration. I apologize for reading through the whole thing, but it's really a remarkable demonstration of the kind of analog computing Ivana was talking about yesterday that this chart does. Now, as I've said, there was no technical barrier to making a chart such as Priestley's earlier in history. The graphic tools necessary to make such a chart were already common centuries earlier among astronomers and cartographers, for example. Again, Ivano's and the other presentations in Beinecke were great on this. This is an opening from the first printed edition of Euclid's Elements, published by Ratdolt in Augsburg in 1482. As you can see, even in the first decades of print, the technical capabilities necessary for making a Priestley-style chart were fully available. In fact, the very next year, Ratdolt published a print edition of the Chronicon by the 4th century Roman scholar Eusebius, which would, right up until Priestley, remain the key European model for chronographics. Priestley overturns this. What this means is that prior to 1765, visualizing historical time as a straight measured line was simply not much use. Conversely, it means that since Priestley, the importance of this manner of visualizing time, the Priestley manner, has never waned. This is not to suggest that the Priestleyan timeline has had no competitors. This stream of time, for example, first published in Germany and Austria at the start of the 19th century and thereafter all over Europe, offers a kind of romantic rebuke to Priestley's attempt to figure historical time as a graph. It replaces Priestley's sterile and uniform grid with bulgy, organic river forms. And yet there along the side is a linear measure. Admittedly, it's not the main visual argument of this chart, but there it is, playing the role that it continues to play today as both a metric reference and as a kind of semiotic key telling us that what we are looking at is time. A few quick words about Priestley. He was a prolific scientist and writer, a member of the Royal Society of London, the American Philosophical Society, close friend of Benjamin Franklin, Richard Price, and others, discoverer of oxygen, inventor of artificial carbonation, political and religious radical. After his home and laboratory were burned to the ground during the Church and King riots of 1791, Priestley fled to the United States, where he lived the final decade of his life as a refugee. Actually, in the United States, his politics turned out to be too radical as well, and in 1797, Cobbett demanded that he be deported under the authority of the new Alien and Sedition Acts, but John Adams, who had admired Priestley for decades, declined to take that step. Through all of this, Priestley remained a determined believer in progress. Personal and legal persecution did not shake his faith. In any case, he thought that particular events were less important than aggregate patterns in the larger shape of history, and this is what he sought to illuminate in his charts. The biographical lines in the chart of biography, Priestley said, were like so many tiny straws swimming on the surface of an immense river of time. To perceive how new Priestley's charts were in their time, we have only to observe that the common line graph was not invented until 20 years later in 1786, and that its inventor, the Scottish economist William Playfair, referred to Priestley's chart of biography as its key precedent, and that Playfair, in his first experiments with the line graph, included Priestley-style chronographics, as in the timelines of the kings of England and France at the top of this image from his commercial and political atlas. 18th century Europe was also, of course, exploding with new technologies at the time, utterly reorganizing not only scientific knowledge, but, as E.P. Thompson famously argued, everyday lived experience. In 1761, John Harrison won the famous English longitude competition with his H4 marine chronometer, capable of maintaining synchronized time across the trials of an transatlantic voyage. In 1785, James Watt, an associate of both Priestley and Playfair, attached an indicator device to a steam engine to record changing pressure in the boiler. During the French Revolution, regularizers promoted a decimal system of timekeeping. Priestley thought that if you organized history by category and laid it out against a measure, you would see quantitative patterns invisible from the perspective of individual lives. You would see periods and you would see movements. The classical period would show as a cluster in the region of philosophy, for example. The Middle Ages would show as a sparsely populated region in science. Though we tend to think of timelines as offering us events in series, Priestley's charts were, in fact, self-consciously, especially powerful mechanisms for displaying synchronism. When you think about real time, you are thinking along the vertical axis of the Priestley space. Priestley knew he had to put names on his chart since he had no hot links, no rollovers, but he encouraged his reader to see the charts primarily as graphic artifacts rather than linguistic ones. In his instructions, he writes, "It is the black lines which are to be attended to. The names were only added because there was no other way of indicating what the lines signified." Given the choice, Priestley probably would have been happy with a rollover, but throughout the design of the work, we find telling visual decisions enforced by the rigors of paper. Decisions about which we have much more flexibility today and also many more opportunities for laziness and indecision. Priestley's format proved adaptable, and it quickly appeared in many different applications. It worked for linear historical time. It could also be used to track cyclical phenomena, such as the harvest seasons. Thomas Jefferson used it to track the availability of vegetables in the Washington, D.C. green markets. Within a decade or two, the format had become so much a part of the common visual vocabulary that it ceased to be regularly attributed to Priestley at all. For Priestley, chronography was about visualizing pattern, and he thought that in his chart of biography, he had revealed at least two of special importance. First, if you look at the right-hand side of the chart, Priestley argued that progress is real. He said that when we visualize history in aggregate, we can actually see this. Prior to the 17th century, progress had always been subject to the possibility of reversal, but during the 17th and 18th centuries, a tipping point had been reached, after which the sheer density of innovation and the speed of intellectual communication had become self-sustaining and borderless. Second, look at the bottom row of the chart, the row of statesmen and warriors. According to Priestley, there is no historical pattern here, except if you consider endless, repeated, and undifferentiated acts of violence to be a historical pattern. The world, Priestley wrote, hath never wanted competitors for empire and power, and least of all in those periods in which the sciences and the arts have been most neglected. Priestley was, of course, not the first scholar to construct a visual tool for displaying historical chronology. We can find many precedents. Ivano has already told us a lot about this. And of course, any year-by-year list of names and events already in some way suggests a metrical approach. Think about the Babylonian, Mesopotamian charts we looked at the other day. But until the 18th century, even the table format, like this one, did not typically hew to a regular measure. In this image, from a 9th century manuscript of Eusebius's Chronicon from the 4th century, you see on one hand the formal discipline applied to the space of inscription, and on the other hand, the difference in relation to Priestley as regards temporal measure. Here, the distance between years, which in this opening ranges between 1 and 4 lines, is determined by the amount of text to be entered in any given year. This is not in any way a design deficiency. Eusebius wanted to put events in order and to synchronize them across traditions. Both things could be achieved without applying a standard visual measure. What's more, his format saved space in the same way the wrap function does in your Excel spreadsheet, and of course, it saved precious writing materials. Yet the very fact that in Priestley's day, tabular chronology had been in use for more than a millennium, and yet was not typically laid out according to a metrically regular format, is powerful evidence that Priestley's chart represents an epistemological sea change. Priestley himself felt this approach to be surprising enough to merit 2 books' worth of explanation. My claim is not that Priestley's work was entirely unprecedented. And indeed, such an approach would be antithetical to Priestley's own view, like Kubler's, about how intellectual change takes place. Already in 1609, the German chronologist Christoph Hellwig had regularized the space of Eusebius's table format, and from the late 17th century, scholars began to experiment with much more complex visual formats, like in the 1685 View of Universal History, which, while still employing a basically Eusebian framework, burst the grid with genealogies and other graphic interventions, while compressing a millennium's worth of information onto a single page. About 1720, the German printer Christoph Weigel transformed the Eusebian grid into a volvel, in which dates were inscribed around the outer edge of the circle and kingdoms were represented by concentric circles in the middle, a movable pointer aligned synchronisms among these circular bands. In a remarkable Back to the Future moment in 1753, the French botanist Jacques Barbeau-Dubourg laid out a Eusebian-type table on a scroll, the very format that had been rejected by Eusebius in the 4th century in favor of the Codex. Barbeau-Dubourg then mounted his 53-foot-long scroll in a purpose-built crank box. Diderot referred to it as a machine chronologique. Among these devices, the most intriguing to Priestley and the most direct precedent for his own work was a chart published in Paris in 1750 by the historian and cartographer Jean-Louis Barbeau de la Bruyère, which combined the virtues of many of the preceding artifacts. Barbeau had worked both with the cartographer Guillaume de Lille and the chronologist Lenglet du Fresnoy, and his chart clearly expresses this double filiation in cartography and chronology. On the one hand, it is obviously an interpretation of the Eusebian format. On it, we find rows for years and columns for themes, just like in Eusebius. But Barbeau does something very different from Eusebius and his continuers. Rather than devoting columns to kingdoms, and I know this is going to sound a little subtle, but it's huge. Rather than devoting columns to kingdoms, in Barbeau's chart, columns represent places, not regimes, but places. Though the shift may seem subtle, the graphic implications are huge. In a Eusebian table, when a kingdom contracts or expands, this is represented by text in the column for that kingdom. This kingdom conquered that place. In Barbeau's chart, when a kingdom expands or contracts, this is represented by a unification or division of the graphic space of adjacent columns. Now the table, channeling this sensibility from cartography, now the table has become a diagram. Priestley had lots and lots of criticisms of Barbeau's chart, and it is in his own adaptation of it, entitled A New Chart of History, he did things very differently. Among other things, he switched the X and Y axes, he cut down on the visual chatter, but above all, he regularized the timeline. In Barbeau's chart, early years were squeezed down, later years were expanded for reasons of his own, but the problem for Priestley was it worked as an index, it no longer worked. It couldn't work as a maker of patterns. Though Priestley's New Chart of History didn't appear until 1769, 4 years after his chart of biography, we know he was already thinking about it in 1765 because he talks about it explicitly. For everything that was successful in Barbeau's model, in Priestley's view, it was torn between the old tabular system. It was caught between the old tabular system of Eusebius and a kind of geographic vision, a kind of cartography that was basically extraneous to the question of time. Priestley sought, in the chart of biography, a more radical simplification. For Priestley, the endpoint of this would be a map without territories where the only thing represented would be time. It was not that Priestley didn't appreciate the value of spatial representation that Barbeau had achieved. In the New Chart of History, he followed that model. But for chronological reference, such as the lives represented in the chart of biography, Priestley aimed to cut that syntax to its barest bones. Once Priestley published the chart of biography, its example caught on quickly. The chart and the accompanying book sold well, eventually going through more than 20 editions, and by the end of the 18th century, it was utterly ubiquitous. This is, of course, a situation that persists today, though unlike in 1765, today no one needs a manual to understand how this thing works. The timeline is a part of our native visual vocabulary, and it is really everywhere. So I have 3 more images to show you. Am I okay? Good, okay. This is mostly for fun. The first image is a screen capture of the editing interface of Final Cut, one of the Apple computer video editing programs. I assure you that Apple is not alone in employing this approach. Moreover, it's not limited to video editing. It's in audio editing, all sorts of other things. I show you this in part to reinforce how unchanged Priestley's visual format remains, and partly to emphasize that Priestley's timeline functioned as an interface, as a tool for stitching together diverse historical facts into a single fabric. Priestley himself considered this aspect of the timeline to be fundamental. He never, ever presented the timeline as a passive reflection of history. To him, it was always a device for doing things with data. This idea, so strong in Priestley's own writing, was not often repeated by his imitators, for whom linear temporal frameworks, those famous homogeneous empty frameworks of Bergson and Benjamin, had become second nature in a way that was utterly impossible in the 1760s. The next image I want to share speaks to that naturalization even more viscerally. This is a panel I love from the cartoonist Randall Munroe, also known as XKCD. I think it's funny, but whether you like the joke or not, you know it's a joke. You know what a timeline is, you know what it's used for, and you know that this is not it. Here, by the way, is a photograph from the Secret Service of what became known as the Rabbit Incident. And here, just echoing the same idea, is a wonderful ad for American Express from the Wall Street Journal a number of years ago, featuring the former football player Tiki Barber, along with a list of the events of his life laid out against the laces of a football. Here, there are no dates, no measurements per se. What's striking is the assumption made by the graphic designer that the passing resemblance of the laces of the ball and the standard timeline would render the chronographic reference obvious, and I think it is. So, to conclude, why return to Priestley today? Because he helps us understand the complexity of the relationship between our ideas and our visualizations. Today we are fairly drowning in data tools, and yet arguably no one has yet invented a device to communicate information about historical relationships faster or more effective than Priestley's. For all of the remarkable graphic innovation of our own time, we are still living within the epistemological regime that Priestley's charts at once announced and consolidated. It is a framework that demands our critique, but I think first and foremost, it demands historicization. While we may not yet be able to foresee an end to its importance in our culture of time, we can see back to its beginnings, and doing so should sensitize us at once to its contingency and to its place in a larger visual and epistemological ecology. Thank you.
Thank you for that wonderful talk. So our second speaker in the morning panel is Jorge Otero Pailos, who's joining us today from Columbia University's Graduate School of Architecture, Planning, and Preservation, GSAP, if you will, where he is Director and Professor of Historic Preservation. Professor Otero Pailos is an architect, an artist, and a theorist specializing in experimental forms of preservation. He is the founder and editor of the journal Future Anterior, co-editor of the book Experimental Preservation, and author of the book Architecture's Historical Turn. Additionally, he has contributed to many scholarly journals and books, including the Oxford Encyclopedia of Aesthetics and Rem Koolhaas's project Preservation is Overtaking Us. Professor Otero Pailos is a member of the Academy of Arts and Sciences of Puerto Rico, and he has received awards from major art, architecture, and preservation organizations, including the American Academy in Rome, the Crest Foundation, the Graham Foundation, the Fitch Foundation, the Canadian Centre for Architecture, UNESCO, and the American Institute of Architects. His work as an artist has been commissioned by and exhibited at major heritage sites, museums, foundations, and biennials, including the UK Parliament, the Venice Art Biennial, the Victoria and Albert Museum, SF MoMA, Hong Kong's Tai Kwon Center for Heritage and Arts, Frieze London, among many other venues. And a personal favorite of mine, I should say, is his ongoing project, The Ethics of Dust, which is a series of artworks using residues from the cleaning of historic monuments, which was exhibited at the 53rd Venice Biennale. And lastly, I'll add that he currently has an exhibition on display along Park Avenue in New York City. The work is titled Analog Sites and will be on view through October. But today in New Haven, he will be giving a talk titled The Bodies Unseen. So welcome.
Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here. Thank you, Eeva-Liisa, for the invitation. I've decided I will stop organizing conferences because you just blew us out of the water. You know, this is so amazing what you've organized for us, and I'm so humbled by everyone's work, which I've had the opportunity to read, and what you just yesterday was already with Deepesh's lecture and Aaron's. What was that performance? It was incredible. So I'm going to be talking about Through Bodies Unseen. It's a line from Lucretius. So Lucretius made an appearance in Priestley's little the highlight that you gave us. So it's already been introduced. So, but I'll talk more about that in a second. So. Let me first begin with The Ethics of Dust, which is the ongoing series that I've been working on for quite a while. It was a book by John Ruskin written about geology. It was a way to teach geology to students, and it was a way to teach the idea that the planet, the Earth, goes from rocks to dust, and then the dust goes back into rocks. Basically, that's the cycle of geology, right? You get limestones, you get all sorts of, right? So he was very interested in this idea that that the material somehow keeps something of a record of itself. It keeps certain kinds of dust form certain kinds of minerals. So it's not all, dust is not all the same. And depending on whether that dust meets each other, it will become a different kind of stone. So I took that book as an inspiration to start thinking about this idea of something becoming something else, and I started working on the book, and I actually started thinking about the idea of writing a book without actually putting any words on the page, by actually removing words from the page. Partly because Ruskin was involved in a whole series of debates about the cleaning of monuments in the 19th century, in which he opposed the cleaning of monuments as he thought that was a way of actually removing the history of the monuments. By the way, in the 19th century, they would actually literally cut the stone on the monument. It was very, very aggressive. So anyway, I unwrote this book, The Ethics of Dust, which you can see here, an installation by J.O.P., no student of fine art. I actually never went to art school. I was told by my art teacher to try to make a living by becoming an architect, that I could add and subtract, so I should, try my hand at architecture. So it is a book that tells a different kind of story, with the story that through which Ruskin started, and one in which I started to think about this cleaning of buildings and this removing of a layer of a building, as well as a kind of unwriting or telling a different story. Of course, one of his favorite buildings in the world was the Doge's Palace, and I was very fortunate to, for the Venice Biennial, have a chance at actually cleaning this wall in the Doge's Palace, which was the last wall that had been not cleaned in the Doge's Palace. And you can see the arch on the left-hand side over there has been cleaned. You can see that Istria stone is very bright white, and this one was kind of grayish. And it hadn't been cleaned, of course, because nobody can see that wall. It's not seen from Piazza San Marco. But here are some images of that Ruskin took, some daguerreotypes that he took himself. And you can see how black the building was in the middle of the 19th century, and you can see on the right how white it is now. And in fact, the building is in this 30-year cycle of cleaning. It's constantly cleaned. And so this idea of care that we have today with monuments involves just constantly washing them. And that's very damaging to the stones, actually. So in fact, the Doge's Palace is mostly a replica of itself. Many of the columns have been removed and replaced with replicas, and then the originals are actually inside of the building. So this facade is to some measure a replica. So we actually cast that wall in latex. I'll tell you more about it, how we do that. And here you have the final cast of that wall, which you see the dust from the wall has been transferred onto this latex cast. and it becomes a kind of one-to-one photograph of the wall, in which you can appreciate the stones. The dust remains in its place, but you can now see the dust as a material on its own and appreciate it on its own. And so the way that I do this is to take liquid latex, so it's pure latex, and then to use the latex then is applied to the wall in its, it's kind of a pasty form, and it is water-based. So it as it sits on the wall, it wets the wall and then softens the dust on the surface of the wall. And then it basically dries. And as it dries, the water only has one way to go. It's away from the wall, so it exerts a kind of pulling pressure on a tension on the surface of the wall, and then it absorbs the dust and then dries. And as it dries, it sets the dust into that latex, and then I can then pull that cast from the wall, as you can see here in this image. And this is actually a cast that I did in the Victoria and Albert Museum in London, which was very special to me because it is actually the interior of Trajan's Column, which you can see two pieces of right behind the latex cast on the left. And it was, of course, it's so tall that they couldn't fit it into the Victoria and Albert Museum, so they actually split that column into two. But what you can see in the left, the cast that I did, is the interior of the plaster cast of Trajan's Column, which is actually a chimney. They put these plaster casts, which were just surface casts. They had to assemble them into a column shape, so they put them on top of a chimney. So this is the interior of the chimney. And no one had gone inside this chimney, so I'd been collecting dust since 1872, essentially. And remember that museums had their windows open all the time. They didn't have air conditioning. So they were collecting the dust from outside. So this was a kind of environmental sensor for me. And I wanted to put this dust inside this room because, of course, this is the grand tour for poor people. This room has all the replicas of all of the greatest hits of European art and architecture. And if you couldn't afford to go on the grand tour, you went to the Victoria and Albert Museum to this room. And I wanted to put pollution in that room. I wanted to show that this room had also collected pollution because without making this pollution, without making this dust, we wouldn't have the civilization that we cherish. So I wanted to put it next to those artworks so that we could have let's say a more fuller accounting of the things that we don't typically count. The extraneous the extraneous materials that we don't count as part of our culture. Now, I had an opportunity to work in London multiple times, and this is another project that was very dear to my heart, which really was a counterpoint to the Doge's Palace, which, of course, for Ruskin was very important that the Houses of Parliament be built in the Gothic style, and that's a whole other story because, of course, they wanted to build it in the neoclassical style, and so he was very much, they should be like the Doge's Palace. So these two buildings are one in relationship to another, but artists have been paying attention to this dust for a very long time. So I'm not the first to pay attention to dust, to environmental dust. I think Deepesh mentioned this yesterday. And of course, Monet was painting the Houses of Parliament through the pollution of London and has this whole series of the various environmental effects that this dust produced. And so it's very hard for us to imagine the experience of going outside and actually looking at the world through this thick fog is like. Only recently did New Yorkers have that experience, and they freaked out, right? Like we had this moment in which we had these fires from the north, and we felt that it was the end of the world. Well, imagine living through the whole 19th century that way. It's so unimaginable to us how much cleaner the air is today than it was in the 19th century. So there's a little bit of hope, that we've cleaned up our air. And it has really been a recent thing. So, you know, in the 1950s already, this was the first time that the air pollution was linked to morbidity rates, because in 1952 they were able to track that when this event of smog happened, right afterwards a bunch of people died. So especially children and elderly people. So very important. And of course, the Houses of Parliament is a place that is always photographed in these events because you get a nice view of it from across, but also because Monet really started documenting it. And so I wanted to work with the actual dust. I didn't want to represent the dust. I didn't want to, you know, draw a picture of the dust. I wanted to actually work with the dust. So the Houses of Parliament is, of course, there's a Big Ben, but if you see that door on the right-hand side, that's the door to Westminster Hall. And Westminster Hall is a 1,000-year-old building, is a Gothic building, which is the reason why the rest of the building, which was built in the 1830s, is neo-Gothic. So with Art Angel, I got a commission to do a public artwork over here. I proposed that we would do a cleaning of the Houses of Parliament, and we spent 6 years doing it. Collaborating with parliamentary estates and a number of other committees inside of the British Parliament to do this. And of course, this was always a public space. So when you can see here, the door, when you walk in, here's somebody going in, there's a policeman over there that asks you where you're going. But then behind it, that you can see that work that we installed, the ethics of dust, about which I'll tell you more in a second. But before we cleaned the wall, this is what the wall looked like. So that door had always been open, and so the dust and pollution from London had gone into that room and essentially done a kind of a timeline on the wall itself. So the whole wall was full of dust, and you can see that it's more polluted towards where the door was open and less stained towards where it was not, where you know, the further end of the hall. And of course, this is the place where kings and queens lie in state. So it's a very symbolic space for the UK. This is, of course, King George the Sixth, and you can see the wall on the left-hand side, how dirty it is, and you can see it. You know, it hadn't changed very much when I walked in, and they had no record of ever actually having cleaned it, except that, of course, when Queen Elizabeth died. You can see that wall is cleaned, and we took a lot of pride to, you know, we said, yep, we cleaned it. You know, it's nice and clean now. Those boxes that you see over there, those are fake. Those are just put there for the journalists to stand and be able to take pictures. So there is the transfer of that dust onto the latex. It was 50 meters long, and really took all of that latex, all that dust out, so you could appreciate it as a material on itself next to the clean wall that was there. So it took us 6 years to do this. It was always a question of when we were going to show it. Here we are in June installing the work. Of course, we didn't realize when we were given the moment, you know, we were told when we were going to open that this was going to be the Brexit vote. It was to be a non-event, so we were there, you know, installing, getting ready for the opening, and all these people showed up, and we're like, wow, look at everybody's so interested in our artwork, you know, isn't it great? And of course, they could care less of what we were doing. They were there to try to pin down the politicians who have to go in through this door, because this is the common entrance to the House of Lords and the House of Commons. Of course, outside, people were gathering in protest, and they were walking down the street, and this is 10 Downing Street, which is down Pall Mall on the way to the Houses of Parliament, and screaming, shame on you, shame on you. They were very, you know, people were upset, and then they were coming down to Parliament Square and then gathering in front of Parliament Square. And the policemen, when people would go, I'd want to go in and talk to Boris Johnson, he would say, nope, sorry, you know, we can't really go in right now, and so on. But then they found out that we had scheduled these time tickets to go see the artwork for free as a public artwork. So everybody in here started getting these tickets to go into Parliament to see the artwork. Of course, nobody went to see the artwork. They went to try to tackle the politicians. But it was a really heady time. One of the politicians, Joe Cox, that was pro-Remain, had been assassinated in the front of her house by a fundamentalist and of the Leave campaign. And this has to do a little bit with Dipesh's talk. You know, that space is so over-determined with the idea of history as a series of political events, of politicians, of kings and queens, of big events. And those are marked in a kind of timeline on the floor of the building through these series of plaques that you can see there on the bottom. So we wanted to tell a completely different story over here, a collective story through this dust of what we've done together to the environment, to the world, to ourselves, and to really capture that and show a different kind of history right there. So because this took on it was nevertheless associated with this political event of Brexit, there was a lot of interest among museums to acquire this piece. And through a long discussion, we made the Solomonic decision to cut it up into pieces and to send one large fragment to each of the nations of the United Kingdom. So there was one sent to Northern Ireland, one to Wales, one to Scotland. Some remained in England. And so here you have one of those pieces being displayed afterwards as, you know, commemorations of different moments of the Brexit vote and so on. But this, of course, really sent me for a loop because, you know, when you think about the idea of having an artwork and chopping up into pieces, normally that means you ruined it. You know, if somebody said, okay, let's take Guernica and chop it up into 7 squares, you know, most people would oppose that or think that you ruined the work if you did that. But actually here the work took on a bigger meaning. You know, the idea of fragmenting it and sending it around really enhanced what the project was about. And so this started making me think about the notion that, in fact, we are dealing with pieces of buildings, that we're dealing with the dust itself, that how we distribute architecture could be a way of rethinking architecture itself. Because when you think about it, this dust, where does it come from? Well, it comes from the boilers of a lot of buildings, you know, to heat them up. And so if heating up buildings and making dust, making soot, is a condition of possibility for you to be able to inhabit those buildings, if you don't heat this building up, we can't hold classes here in the winter. Then the dust is just as important as the concrete. In other words, we can't inhabit architecture without making that dust. So it seemed to me that the dust was an architectural material, but it's also a movable architectural material. So the idea of moving pieces, that architecture doesn't sit in one place, to me was very important. Because, of course, we've come to think of architecture as immovable. And in fact, in Italian or Spanish, you call architecture immovable, and then art is movable property. So I started thinking about this notion of monuments being movable or distributable, or the notion of the distributed monument. And then started thinking about what would it mean if we started to put the pieces together from different monuments, you know, rather than just one monument and one cast. You know, what would it mean if we started to do multiple, and kind of what kind of story could we tell if we brought different pieces from around the world? This was a piece that I did as a resident at the American Academy in Rome, where I took different pieces of actually the Academy site to try to retell the story. And the Academy site really was an inspiration to me. And this is where, of course, you know, you're sitting around with all these classicists, and I'm, you know, having lunch with them, and you're talking about dust, and they're like, Lucretius, he's the one that started talking about dust first. And of course, Lucretius was the one that started looking at dust as a way to think about the basic elements of the earth. And that led to this work. And so this work was both, on the one hand, the piece that I just showed you, but on the other hand, it was also the traces of that work on the walls itself. So this is a permanent installation at the American Academy. And if you look on the right, that is the cast of the cast is on the left, on the right is the clean wall. So the clean wall, I don't know if you can see right at the base of the arch, there's a kind of bikini line. Above it is a little bit darker, below it is a little bit lighter. below it is what I cleaned. Above it is the wall with the dust on it still. So I wanted to show the difference between the clean and unclean. And so they've promised me they will never clean this wall again. So the whole idea here is that this will continue to, over time, soil again. But it was interesting to me because, of course, the wall itself is a series of distributed monuments. It has all of these fragments of ancient Rome in it, which, by the way, the archaeologists have no clue where they come from. They're very, they're kind of indescript. But the notion for me that the dust on those fragments is also a fragment, and that we could think about them together was very important. And of course, Lucretius started thinking about dust because he was looking at monuments, and he was looking at the fact that people would touch ancient sculptures, and that as they touched those ancient sculptures, they were rubbing off. And he said, I don't see anything coming off the sculpture. So what is it but something's coming off because the sculpture is getting worn down. So he said, there must be an element there that we cannot see that is the basic element of what makes the world. And of course, he started theorizing what we now call the atom. And he said, through bodies unseen, does nature do its work? So the idea of that we don't see it, but it's happening, and that there's something there, it was very important to me. And then I started a series of works working with museums to actually collect the dust in their museums and to think about the work that dust does in the museum, the kind of unseen, the bodies unseen inside the museums. And this is from the Para Museum in Istanbul, a work that I did to start to now looking under the microscope at the dust and characterizing the dust at each of these museums. So that notion of going from large to small, the microscopic to the larger casts, really is informative for me, because here's a work that I did. This was exhibited in Australia, but it's actually a work from an ancient Roman mine in Spain, which was the old Roman mines of silver. And of course, the larger the Roman Empire got, the more silver they needed in order to put more people into the economy. That's how you became Roman. You got literally denaros in your pocket. And the more people, the more denaros they needed to produce. So they needed to conquer silver mines. And what was fascinating to me, having done this cast, was that the dust that we collected from those casts in Spain were actually found in the North Pole, the same dust. And they were able to trace it because one of the byproducts of making silver is making lead, and lead has a very stable isotope that can be mapped right back to the mine where it came from. And so here we are, 2,000 plus years later, collecting dust from a Roman mine, and that dust is still around, is still mappable, is still there. And how many buildings from the Roman Empire are left? Not many. Will this building be here 2,000 years from now? I don't think so. I don't know. I mean, they build it out of concrete, but is Yale going to be around 2,000 years from now? Highly unlikely. So, but our dust, the dust that we produced here, that'll be on the record. That'll be on the record. So it made me think of the dust as our most important monument today. Like, this is the architecture that we really need to be talking about. This is the dust that is our collective monument. This is what we're making. And so actually looking into these dusts and so on, I realized that there are all these ideas about how we start to think about dust in relationship to the planetary, and that ties to some things that Deepesh said yesterday, but that the dust is really, we are trying to think of other planets in terms of dust, that the dust is the way that we understand planetary life or world making and so on. So we're using these sites as analog sites for thinking about other planets. And in fact, it was, to me, very interesting to then find out that this site in Spain was actually being used in a collaboration with NASA as an analog site for the colonization and the exploration of Mars. Because that Roman mind, the work that the Romans did there was so massive that they completely destroyed the ecology of that space. And so it actually looks barren like Mars. And so it is now used as a way to model experiments that would be done in Mars. And what they're trying to model is how do we collect dust from Mars? That the idea is how do we collect dust in this Roman mine in Spain will teach us how to collect it in Mars. And why are we collecting it in Mars? In order to figure out whether there is a biosignature in Mars. In other words, whether we can find bacteria in Mars, whether there is something in Mars that really tells us that there has been life there, and because the life gets embedded into the stone. So analog sites became a kind of generative concept for me about how do we think of something or do experiments in one place to think about another place. And I started thinking, of course, of distributed monuments that way, that we can move a piece of dust, a piece of architecture from one place to another in order to think about another place, just in the same way that these analog sites are being thought about. And of course, there's many analog sites around the world that are being used for this purpose. And one of them was, of course, is Svalbard in the north of Norway. And I, of course, then got very interested in this, and there's many dimensions to this story. But then I became interested in where did this notion of analog site actually get signed into a treaty? You know, where did they figure this out? And of course, they signed a treaty at the American Embassy in Norway, in Oslo. And so through a whole other project, I started to think about taking pieces of that American Embassy, and instead of pieces of the dust, taking pieces of the American Embassy. And one of those pieces was the fence around the embassy itself. And that fence then became those fragments of that building to think about analog sites that I brought to New York. And that's what the exhibit on Park Avenue is all about, is called Analog Sites. And the sculptures are placed in front of very particular buildings, the Seagram building and the Park Avenue Armory, to really try to think about those sites themselves as analog sites back for the experimentation of other places, and for raising awareness about the importance to preserve certain kinds of architecture, in particular modern architecture. But that's a whole other dimension, you know, that opens up over here. But that's at least a taste and an introduction to, you know, that's a whole other thing we could talk about, is the exhibition on Park Avenue. But in a way, it gives you a sense of how I got there and the relationship to the ethics of dust. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you for a fascinating and very inspiring talk. Last but certainly not least, we will be hearing from Lake Varea, who join us from Mexico City. Bienvenidos. Lake Varea is a queer duo working in conceptual photography, formed in 2005 by Francisca Rivero Lake and Carla Varea. Their work explores concepts of expanded photography through installation, textile, performance, sculpture, and video. By experimenting with photographic techniques and formats that question authorship, their work highlights their combined identity to create intimate portraits of architecture, artists' archives, and people. Their process utilizes different cameras and formats, both analog and digital, which they use to experiment with long exposures and time. Through the practice of slow photography, moreover, they're able to perceive what the eyes cannot see at a first glance. Their work has been exhibited internationally for almost 2 decades. In 2011, they started the Dark Room series, which portrays iconic modernist houses like Philip Johnson's Glass House in full moonlight and complete darkness. revealing details in spaces that are otherwise unimportant, seemingly, in daylight. Beyond this series, Lake Varea has a special interest in portraying personal archives, which led them to engage the archives of Frida Kahlo, Diego Rivera, Luis Barragan, as well as Joseph and Annie Albers. And their work on the latter German emigres subsequently became the subject of a book titled Annie and Joseph Albers, Lake Varea, published by Hatje Kans in 2021. These are but some of the many projects they've undertaken in recent years. They've also exhibited their work at the Vitra Design Museum in Germany, the Palacio de Bellas Artes in Mexico City, as well as galleries in Paris, Madrid, and beyond. And their work can be found in the permanent collection of the Museum of Modern Art. Their talk for today will expand upon the notion of how, as artists, they emit time, and how they explore time travel through photography, through different techniques, devices, and subjects. So, welcome.
Hello, thank you, Eva, and all the Yale team for this beautiful invitation.
My name is Francisca Rivero Lake,
And I am Carla Varea,
and together we are
Lake Varea.
Thank you all for coming this morning and sharing the following 25 minutes with us.
We hope you enjoy the ride.
Please sit comfortably and relax your minds.
We travel in time and never come back to the same place we left.
We are artists.
We're photographers.
We are storytellers.
We do architecture.
We use cameras made in different times, historical times, and manufactured in various geographical places.
We work in our studio in Mexico City and also around the world.
Today, we're taking you to tour our minds and our archives.
We're going to geek out about cameras and optics,
About whispers and dreams.
about personal narratives and historical figures.
Here, you're looking at a photo we made in January 5, 2024.
Shot and analogically hand-processed by us in our studio in Mexico City.
This photograph was taken with a mammoth camera made in the late 19th century.
The 19th century camera is taking a photo of the most advanced machine we've bought during our honeymoon in Japan, May 2023.
This is a digital Nikon with a 2000 millimeter zoom.
This photograph is part of a series called Smile, Click.
It is a unique handmade in our studio, and it's now in view in Madrid, in Spain.
At the same time, we are here now.
In Yale University, looking at it with you.
Where is here?
And where is now?
This is only the beginning of a riddle.
Here, you can see a self-portrait.
Yes, it's a self-portrait. Can you see me holding the shutter?
We're together with the two mammoth cameras.
Can you see how massive they are?
They're so big that we have to place them on a steel table that has wheels and can be moved around the studio.
The steel table is strong enough to carry the four of us at the same time.
And that is very practical.
Do you think a 130-year-old camera still has something to say?
Do you think that this 130-year-old camera can still surprise us technologically?
Do you think that we can use this equipment of the past and combine it to the present technologies to create innovative images?
Well, we know the answer.
And
the
it's
answer
yes.
is yes.
Look deeply into the image, and you will see, as a result of an image, that is the first inhale of the image that has traveled through the open camera of the lens and into a photosensitive paper as a negative. We processed it manually into these chemicals, emitting a direct negative.
So here is the process. 1.
We place the photosensitive paper in the darkroom into the chassis.
2.
We position the optics to be portrayed in front of the mammoth camera.
3.
We light the space.
4.
We open the lens and place the glass plate in the back of the mammoth camera to see the image traveling through the lens.
5.
Following our instincts, we frame the portrait by looking at the placement of the object. Moving the camera and dancing with the lights under the composition is very compelling.
6.
We open up the chassis.
7.
We open up the lens.
8.
We chronograph with time and precision, 1, 2, 3 minutes, depending on the density we are looking for.
11.
We close the lens.
12.
We close the chassis.
13.
We carry the heavy chassis to the darkroom and start the alchemical developing process.
3 minutes.
Into the developer.
30 seconds.
In the stop path.
3 minutes.
In the first fixer.
3 minutes.
In the second fixer.
20 minutes.
Underwater with the drip constant movement.
Then it is time to take the print out of the water
Squeeze the excess liquid.
and place it in the drying net for the next 22 to 48 hours.
After 72 hours of extreme detailed observation,
Then, and only then, we may know if the photograph is
a yay or a nay.
Time,
emit, time.
Now that we have explained this part of the time-consuming process, we will keep on going into the next phase.
Traveling through time and space.
The black and white photographs of the cameras you will see next,
Were all made as we just explained.
all made in our studio between December 2023 and January 2024.
All made with this antique mammoth camera.
All hand-processed by us.
All on view at the exhibition at the Galería Caja Negra in Madrid until May 2024. Time, emit, time. One mammoth takes the portrait of another mammoth.
Mammoth format cameras were built in the US between 1880 and 1890.
They're wooden boxes with leather bellows and brass accessories.
They were meant as view cameras for portrait and studio.
She has a capacity to make the largest negatives we have ever seen.
She demands the highest concentration, thoroughness, and delicacy to handle and use her.
And this is how we click. With Mammoth, we've made 4 series of work between 2020 and 2024.
The first series we made in 2020 was titled Argent,
Silver recognizing itself.
silver objects on silver gelatin paper.
These objects tell the story of our own personal history,
They intertwine our history before us.
what we call memories of the future.
Here we see Verea's grandparents' signature engraved on a silver tray, giving to my grandparents for their silver wedding anniversary in 1964.
Decades before we were born.
Time, emit, time. Here, this is the portrait of an 18th century sugar bowl made with Mexican silver for the Japanese market.
A beautiful example that has survived centuries to tell us a story of multiculturalism and trade in the past.
The bowl, owned by our uncle, sparked our interest to immerse ourselves in Japan.
Little did we know that 3 years later we would spend 2 months fulfilling that dream.
Honeymooning in Japan.
After doing our Argent series, we wanted to push to the next frontier.
Color.
Oh, what an adventure.
Color is complex and behaves in a very different way.
Color filters are used to block and push specific aspect of the color spectrum.
Depending on the light and on the filters, the result changes radically.
We chose to portray color candles and went crazy with the experimentation.
We used all kinds of filters, and the result blew our minds.
Although we kept a thorough log of the process.
The result is impossible to repeat.
On the portraits that you see,
Each candle is a different color,
yet none of the colors that you're seeing.
and the real color. none of the colors that you see are the real colors of the candles.
In this series, we stretch time.
We wanted to see how long it takes for these double candles to totally melt down.
And how long these long exposures, how many long exposures we could do before they melted.
We used the same filters,
The same long exposure time.
the same chemicals.
And well, you can see the poetic result.
Time, emit, time.
Ah,
But before we forget,
let us tell you why these candles have a special meaning for us.
they're special because they're handmade by a family business in Mexico that have been doing artisanal candles since the 1880s.
Exact time as a mammoth cameras was made.
These candles are made in the most traditional way,
The wax comes directly from the bees.
and the color from the botanical natural dyes.
We commissioned Cereria de Jesus family for these candles for our wedding day.
The double candles and the double candles are an analogy of ourselves, merging together over time.
The candle candles match the flowers in the garden of the wedding lunch we held in February 11, 2023 in Mexico City.
This camera is Verea's before Lake Verea. It's a Mamilla RZ made in Tokyo, Japan.
First manufactured in 1970.
And this one is made in 1994.
It's a serious camera.
She has an extremely precise focus that is possible thanks to the bellows that allow, in a very practical way, to compensate light adjustments so the focus point is clear in the final image.
She is ideal for long exposures,
And she has another rare and beautiful feature.
which is that we can rotate the chassis 90 degrees and create horizontal or vertical images without removing the back. And this is how
we
I click.
With this Mamilla RZ Pro, Verea shot her seminal bodyguard series, in which she portrayed over 153 bodyguards from diverse socioeconomical status.
Between 2000 and 2004, I traveled extensively throughout Guatemala, where bodyguards were common for a very wide variety of people that needed protection in a country that had been under civil war for more than 30 years.
The subjects, all portrayed in front of a wide backdrop, to center the attention on the bodyguard that you're never supposed to see.
Armed with this powerful Mamilla RC camera and her extreme focus, I asked them not to pose. And instead, I asked them to do what they do all day, which is waiting.
Some pointed at their guns at her, her pistols, their rifles, and the shotguns at her and at the camera.
Some posed proudly with their weapons with confidence.
Others imitated the movie stars that fed their visual culture.
The Bodyguard series is a coming-out story, the last as a solo artist and the first with Lake, which we worked together helping each other from the beginning of our relationship.
We both fed on the strength, the courage, and the power of these portraits.
We have transformed this series into installation, videos, and many exhibitions.
What you see here is the most recent installation, entitled Bodyguards in the Land of Shadows. It was exhibited at the Blackwood Gallery at the University of Toronto between January and March 2024.
Time, emit, time. Since 2006, we have been working on portraying the architect Luis Barragan early buildings in Mexico City.
This series started as a commission by Daniel Garza Usabiaga, and it is the first series we created together as Lake Verea.
We started lurking, observing, shooting, and studying the old forgotten buildings.
And got beaten by the modern bug that hasn't left us ever since. Time, emit, time.
We made this first exhibition in 2009 under the title Barragan in Context, shown at Museo de la Ciudad de Mexico and then in Seoul Art Center.
In 2010, we were invited to propose a project for the world-famous house and studio of Luis Barragan.
We panicked. The house has been photographed ad infinitum by the very best.
Barragan started building this house in 1947 and kept it as a work in progress until his death in 1988.
Now it's paused in time, as he left it.
The house, conceived as a personal heaven, has become a must-see and a selfie must-have in recent years.
In 2010-2011, we went over and over to visit the house.
We looked and read many books, as many as we could, about the architects.
We read Barragan Pritzker acceptance speech.
And there, it was there where we found the clue that was missing.
We had overlooked and was there to find it.
The quest for
Silence,
solitude,
penumbra,
beauty,
and happiness, never to be forgotten.
In this speech, these are some of the concepts he underlined as fundamental to understand architecture.
In 2011, with our ally Mamiya RC and her capacity for long exposures, we went out and portrayed the house as only he had seen it in full moon nights.
In silence and solitude.
For over 2 years, we secretly spent nights never turning the lamps on.
Letting our eyes adapt to the darkness.
Hearing Barragan's whispers.
Letting the house speak the language of lightlessness.
Of intimacy.
The Darkroom series, Barragan in Penumbra, has been showed in so many exhibitions and is part of very important collections.
The first Master Technica was designed in 1934.
And the last one was made in 2012.
She's the world's first all-metal folding field camera.
And this is how it clicked. We have worked intensively with this camera.
We love her. We proudly own 2 Master Technicas.
The first one was won as a prize given to Berea by the British Journal of Photography in 2007, awarded for the Bodyguard project that we just spoke about.
We bought the second Master Technica in 2012 in an auction.
With Master Technica, we have made countless photos.
In plentiful locations around the world.
And have had innumerable adventures.
October 2016, New York City.
While attending at the gallery at the New York City Gallery, presenting a group show about Luis Barragan, legacy, and the influences, one of our photos of the series, Darkroom, Barragan in Penumbra, was on view.
A lovely woman standing next to us, who is here, asked us if we knew who the author at that photo, right next to the Joseph Albers photo of that Mexican pyramid, was. Unison we reply,
It's ours! We introduced ourselves.
She introduced herself back as Brenda Danilowitz, chief curator of the Joseph and Annie Albers Foundation.
And we started a conversation.
That keeps on going and flowing till today.
A few days later,
we received an email inviting us to do a residency at the Albers Foundation in Bethany, Connecticut.
What a dream!
Flattered, we quickly answered and chose the fall of the next year to have that snow and to attend to that residency program.
A year went by fast. Time amid time.
While at the residency,
surrounded by nature in the beautiful house studio,
day by day,
we started to visit Annie and Joseph's archive.
We read about them in books.
We listened to the whispers that guided our dreams.
We soon realized we were sitting in the same chairs they had been.
And as you can see, we had to immortalize this unique opportunity to sit where they sat.
We read with interest and curiosity their personal correspondence between each other and with other people we had researched and photographed in the past.
It was
all connected. They, us, their circle of friends, our heroes, modern spirit, all connected. Time amid time.
We started to portray their most personal belongings.
Joseph's sketches.
His color tubes.
His spatula.
His cameras.
His photos of Mexico.
His ideas materialized in paper.
We could feel his hand.
We were together, past and present in communion.
In a singular present.
The three of us.
Time amid time. Annie started to unveil.
Little by little.
Her voice.
Her sensuality.
Her intelligence.
Her economy of materials.
Her capacity to turn everyday objects into timeless works of art.
blew our minds.
Textiles made out of text from cutouts from newspaper.
Weaved with cord,
Modest in size.
gigantic in impact.
The three of us together sharing the present moment. Time emits time.
Linhof Technica was a perfect ally.
Her bellows and capacity to push and emphasize specific focus.
Allowed us to step away from the simplistic documentation of the objects.
Evolving into a personal portrait, pushing our point of view.
We spent endless days in the archive, living in an in-between time,
We immersed ourselves in their world.
their possessions.
We had conversations across time and space.
We felt welcomed by the couple that described themselves as a cult of two.
So do we.
And for a moment, we became a cult of 2 plus 2.
Time, emit, time. The result is an intimate connection.
And it is published in the book Annie and Joseph Albers by Lech Berea, published by Hatchekans in 2021.
2018-2019, Palacio Bellas Artes, Mexico City.
We are invited,
Carte
carte blanche, to make an exhibition for the Museum of the Palacio de Bellas Artes' 85th anniversary.
Let us just say, Palacio de Bellas Artes and the Museo Palacio de Bellas Artes are the most important cultural institution of our country.
The highest honor.
The cherry of the cake.
We have visited the building since we were toddlers.
Attended ballet, exhibition, operas.
We marveled at the mural paintings.
The building and its history parallels modern Mexico.
The construction starts in the 19th century, in the 1900s, as an avant-garde European construction, Art Nouveau in style, steel structure, Carrara marble exterior.
Revolution starts in 1910 and finishes in 1921.
The building opens its door in 1934 as a post-revolutionary Art Deco Mexican modern palace.
After the revolution,
The country, the people, the government has changed. Time, emit, time.
Modern Mexico no longer looks at Europe as a cultural reference.
Newly discovered Mayan and Aztec stone deities are modernized in Art Deco style.
Mexico looks at its roots and cultures as a source of pride and identity.
To celebrate the Palacio, we decided to look deeply into the architecture,
The decoration,
the materials,
the sculptures,
the mural paintings.
the metal work.
Fascinated by the massive scale and the abundance of the elements,
We decide to portray the most stunning fragments and reproduce them 1-to-1 scale.
a measure tape, the Linhof Technica, zooms were our allies.
Carefully, we selected the fragments, measured them with precision, shot them, and print them in the exact same size as they are in the building.
The exhibition took place between September and November 2019.
With more than 30,000 visitors.
Once the exhibition was installed at the museum,
The shock of the confrontation was unforeseen.
the handmade beauty of the elements and the materials was a revelation.
We touched and reproduced history.
We merged past and present.
Time, emit time.
Mamiya C330, made in Tokyo, Japan.
She was introduced in 1969 and was manufactured until 1983.
She uses twin lenses, meaning that with the upper lens you compose and focus.
And with the lower lens, she opens directly into the negative.
She was made for amateurs and professionals.
She is lightweight and shoots fast.
She's known as the Japanese jewel.
She was introduced as a first camera with a self-cocking shutter.
She uses no battery and has the beautiful feature that allows us to do double exposures.
And this is how we click.
But now let's go back to 2011.
The modern bug is kicking hard.
Fascinated to see the abysmal differences between what we see in the architectural books and the reality of the modern architecture in Mexico City,
We started to fantasize about the houses made in the US by the great by the great European modern architects.
R.M. Schindler,
Richard Neutra,
Walter Gropius,
Marcel Breuer.
Mies van der Rohe.
The fact that the US houses are not behind fences was a big trigger.
So we started to research over the internet for these addresses.
There were few sites with information.
Do you remember the site of the Modern Triangle?
This was big help.
We looked up the addresses on printed maps and followed GPS apparatus to get to the destinations.
So many adventures while looking for these houses.
As the research progressed,
Enthralled to witness the difference between the heroic pictures of the books and the reality,
we started to see that we could tell the story in a different way.
through our eyes and images,
And Paparazza Moderna was born.
time
Emit time.
Paparazza Moderna rules.
2 identical Mamiya C330s cameras with different lenses that we exchanged throughout the escapades.
Kodak Hector film.
We arrived to the houses unannounced.
Get as close as possible.
Shoot fast.
Shoot details in the spark of our interest.
The road trips and the research on the internet as an ongoing archive kept feeding information.
Paparazza Moderna took from 2011 to 2018 to complete.
We shot over 40 houses that were built between 1921 and 1951.
The project finally took shape as composition that sum up the interpretation of each house.
Throughout the houses, we could tell the story of the personal history of the architects.
We divided the project in 3 chapters.
Chapter 1.
Walter Gropius versus Marcel Breuer in New England.
Chapter 2.
R.M. Schindler versus Richard Neutra in California.
Chapter 3.
Mies van der Rohe versus Philip Johnson.
All 3 chapters have the following common thread.
They all start as friends and collaborators.
They influence each other.
There is a fight, a conflict.
They separate ways.
Over time, there is a reconciliation.
The image that you see is the Haggerty house.
The first house that Gropius and Breuer built together upon their arrival in the U.S.
The house was finished in 1938.
Both of their names written on stone.
We shot this house in 2011.
Isn't she beautiful?
Oh yes, it's a dream of a collaboration.
Now this is a Bell house, the house of their breakup.
It was built in 1941 and shot in 2011.
Can you see the blue gorilla guarding the entrance in the center of the composition?
The graveyard stones everywhere.
It makes us wonder, is it possible for a house to keep the aura of separation?
Well, as we can see, fiction could never be as accurate as a reality we experienced. Time. Emit time.
A whole series in Paparazza Moderna was shown at Vitra Museum in Germany to coincide the 100th anniversary of the Bauhaus in 2019.
Time. Emit time. Now, let's go back to the present.
Before we finish, as a reminder of the trip we took for the past 25 minutes or so, here is a chart of the projects we've reviewed. We consider architecture as a living being.
Architecture knows how to talk if you know how to listen.
We play in between times.
We dream in between seconds.
We portray still objects that came before us.
And without a doubt, they will last longer than us.
Each camera we use brings a unique way to capture images that travel through light and time. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
So I would like to invite our speakers from this morning panel up for some Q&A. Perhaps I'll sit here and yes. Okay. One more. So we have roughly 25 minutes for Q&A. And I'll give the audience some time to think of their questions before I harvest them from you all. And before doing that, I would like to ask a thematic question that sort of cuts across the presentations we just heard in this morning panel, Measures of Time. And it's a question that pertains to the relationship between measurement and standardization, right? Because to measure time, of course, a measurement is predicated upon the existence of standards, right? To make time accessible, knowable, and representable through systems of graphic notation and units of measurement. So I'm wondering how each of you perceives the role of standardization in your subjects of study, and moreover, if we can speak of a sort of poetics of standardization that emerge through meanings or ideas or messages that sort of arise out of standards, and they're used to measure time, but perhaps sort of elude or escape those standards and how they instrumentalize time to make it knowable. And so I know it's a big question, but just in thinking about some of the presentations we just heard, standards of pollution, let's say standards of cleanliness, of course, standards of graphic notation with the horizontal lines, and then maybe even standards of a particular camera device and the film used in that device. So I invite you to reflect upon that, these measures of time.
I think that one's for you.
Yeah, I'll try to start. Obviously it's all over the materials that I'm looking at. One of the things I've been trying to think about is, again, what happens when you move from verbal to a graphic medium. And of course, you can express measurement in a verbal medium just as well as in a graphic medium, but you express it in different ways and under different strictures. And so this is from some of the material on uncertainty that I didn't get a chance to talk about. When the source materials that Priestley is using to talk about biography are sometimes very ambiguous about, we don't know if a given historical figure was born in the 4th century BC or the 2nd century BC. And in words, you can just say that. And you're asking about standards. It's quite exact to say someone lived between the 4th century and the 2nd century BC. But you can express it in a very free way. As soon as you're inside the graphic format, assuming that you're going to place the lifeline once, and assuming you're going to represent the lifeline in a scale which is appropriate to an individual life, you've got a problem. And that problem demands a new kind of graphic solution. You can't just drop them. You can't say somewhere between here and there, and you can't just drop the line anywhere. And so in Priestley, this produces a lot of graphic creativity. And so one way of answering your question would be to say that standard is most interesting to me when it moves from genre to genre and medium to medium, because it's in those translations that you see these kinds of, and I think both the other presentations today got at this, it's then that you see a lot of formal novelty.
A slightly different take, related, but I think of jazz standards. They're the things you keep returning to, and Aaron made me think of this. They're the things that you keep returning to because there's a kind of agreement that they are worth returning to because they set a common language, and also they are the frame through which a kind of collective legibility of everything else is possible. So, the jazz standard is a standard because all other jazz, in a way, owes something to it. And in that sense, I find that very interesting too, because when you bring up standards and you set measures, we're immediately drawn to the notion that to standardize is to measure, but it's not. And I think that Eeva-Liisa is pushing us to try to think of standards as shapes, as other ways in which we can bring attention to a collective attention or a collective way of looking or understanding, a collective understanding of, let's say, time. And that, to me, the idea that a standard can be a shape, I think is very interesting, and in fact something that in your work I found very interesting, because it was this notion, you kept returning to the camera as the standard for photography somehow, that there is a kind of, and the way that you use the old camera and the new camera, and they become part of the portraiture. I found that really beautiful, because they are protagonists. That your cameras are, they're part of the. I mean, like, I want to. That by the end, I was thinking Lake Verea is the name of a camera. Lake Verea camera, right? Like it's.
We love cameras.
Thank you for that. Actually, yes, I was. Thank you for noticing that. That is truly important for us. And regarding the question, I think that you saw cameras from different times, yes. And analog photography would probably only span 150 years in history. So for us now that you see a camera made in the 1920s, in the 1900s, in the 1960s, in the 1980s, it seems like a big difference technologically. But like in a 200 years or something, it's going to be like, well, they're all the same. No? Because time also, because it's closer to us, we see the big difference. But once we will see it in a long scale of time, when time passes, probably it's going to be like, oh, it was something that just happened and entered and went. Also, for us, exactly, using cameras from different times allows us to use different aesthetics. The way that things were seen in another moment, and to be able to capture present moments with that aesthetic for us is really interesting, because it's really time traveling in a way. Also, it is a modern building with a building from the 1920s with a camera from the 1970s, seeing in 2011, and now we're seeing in 2024. No? So all these points in relation makes a very interesting constellation of times, and it's all comprised in the same image.
I mean, because the way that, for example, the eye of the camera becomes your eye, and the way that you showed those photographs of the cameras next to the masks of those Mexican interpretations of, those bronze casts of the grills in the Art Deco building, that they looked like cameras all of a sudden. The eyeballs were kind of like shutters, right?
So beautiful.
Perfectly round, and that you photographed that next to me was really beautiful, because you start to see the shape, the shaping of time through this technological medium.
And also you're like hitting to a dead end on the analog film and the analog process, and so it's also interesting to be playing with something that is like, we don't know when it will expire, but we see papers running out of print, Kodak disappearing, film disappearing, and it's just like we're playing against time, just to like get the best and play with these cameras that are still using, and also these optics that were made by humans. And so these layers of optics to see something specific at this time, if it's a panoramic, and where is that focus in that lens? Or if it's an apple, so it doesn't have any aberration. So it goes technically so deep into such work of minds inside humanity. Either you use them to see from the sky to below, to see zooms that you could never see the moon, the eclipse, like these brand new neutral density filters are brand new. And it was incredible that they were like selling them for this eclipse. I was like, oh, I can't get them on time.
I think we can open up the discussion to accept questions from the audience. Alphonse?
I can just yell.
Thank you so much, first of all, David, for the wonderful introduction today, for starting the panel, and for such luminous, breathtaking presentations. I'm really taken by each of it, but I wanted to ask maybe a broader question. And focusing then on considering time after time, one particular element that I was drawn to in all of your presentation is the understanding of persistence and permanence. And I'm really curious then about that afterlife that comes after the measurement, the afterlife that comes after the act of creation. And I'm really curious as to how each of you negotiate that impermanence of the material against, in a way, the persistence of memory. And I just want to invite maybe reflections from all of you if possible. But yes, thank you.
Who wants to start?
Well, maybe I'll do the provocative part. So for us is what we aim to do by going back to these modern buildings and to these legacies of either architects or the different subjects that we take. It's also in a way to make them present by giving them a different way to understand them. No? So as you were saying, with looking at the chat and now seeing the eyes as shutters, it is in that same way that for us is taking over a history that has been told to us, that we do not conform to it, and then we try to make our own version. If this is going to prevail longer than us, well, we don't know. But in that sense, we try to make it alive in a way, and try to make it our own, to surpass, as true rebels that we are, what we have been taught, and to make our own versions out of it.
I'd say a couple of things. One is, so of course the artifacts that I'm looking at themselves thematize duration, permanence, but the artifacts are also historical, and so two thoughts about that. One is, part of my project is about experiencing these old objects as if they were new again, as if they were new, because I think that it allows us to see things that in our environment that we take for granted and not taking for granted. The other thing, so that's formal, but there's also, and this is where I really think about Ari's presentation, these are also material objects. We saw them in the Beinecke yesterday. My favorite crazy experience with the Priestley charts, I've gone all over the world. There are about 20 of them known to be extant, and tried to see them all. In the basement of the American Philosophical Association in Philadelphia, a librarian and I opened up one of these big folders that had a chart biography in it. And when he lifted the cardboard cover, maybe you know the physics of this, I don't know if it's suction or wind or what happens, but there's some sort of pull up from the chart, and we were just surrounded by a cloud of dust, which was not the air from the 18th and 19th centuries, it was the chart, which had disintegrated. And when he opened it, the chart came out as all of these fragments, all of this dust, and all over both of us. And I had an image, which I didn't show you today, of one of these uncertainty dots that Priestley adds to the lives when he doesn't know where they begin or end, that's become detached. And so it persists, but it's completely torn out of context, and there's no way anymore to put it back. And there's also actually there was no way to save it, because for the library it's just too much work. So somewhere in the ventilation system of the American Philosophical Society in Philadelphia is one little bit of uncertainty.
And in your lungs.
And in my lungs.
Presumably you embodied research.
That's beautiful, actually.
There were a few other hands I saw up.
Well, you've moved in the direction I'm interested in, which is the personal, individual experience of space and time. And seeing an old object as new, being on an airplane 4 times, 6 times a week, and then meanwhile the dust is gathering in your home. The experience of place, which was interesting and historically as a way to experience time, and in a lifetime how you go back to space and place, and it can be deteriorating, improving, frozen. I walk through Yale and go, am I the person that was here 40 years ago? Am I not that person? I'm curious how you all would approach that topic of the individual's personal space-time experience.
Which individual would go first?
Well, we create characters in order to experience different individual types and then to go into mind frames of what we want to portray and the attitude towards whatever the series that we're working on. So we live in multiple personal times, I think.
And when we see those photos, it takes us immediately back to what we created, but we're no longer there, what we were, what we are. And they're inside of us. It's like a story, like a novel.
So we...
and we're talking we because I don't think we have an individuality.
Exactly. So we may be Paparazza Moderna from 5 to 7, and then Carmen Francisca from 7 to 9, and then Lic Berea from 10 to 12, and so forth. So we live in multi-systems and multi-worlds at the same time, according to the position and the character that we are playing, or doing, or experiencing. So it becomes a little bit more complex.
I mean, it's a very tough question, but I guess, you know, a lot of the work that I do has been a really, you know, just a pursuit of something that you don't really know what you're after, you know, but it didn't, I guess for me, it wasn't the pursuit of an individual or the pursuit of or individuality, or you know, or that there are some historians that are interested in biography and like, you know, that kind of personal agency but I think your question for me opens up this whole notion of you know, the way, the kind of unexpected ways in which we are individuals, but without, you know, without really being able to help ourselves, you know, the things that we just cannot not do. And that's for me, the record that I'm interested in, you know, that what I see, these are all the dust, for example, the soot, these are not like things we want or things we decide, but we all do collectively decide. And so that kind of trace of the individual as part of a larger story that is not necessarily one that is willed into existence. You know, it comes out of, it's a kind of offset of that will. You know, so that is I think part of the record that we don't examine so much. You know, that's why for me Westminster Hall was so important, because it is all about the will, the political will, the kind of, you know, it's the individual driving history. And I wanted to show that in that very space there's a whole completely other record that we just choose not to look at. So in order to be able to have us look at it, it took a lot of effort, you know, to get it, to show it. But it's there. So I guess that, and I think that we, you know, as individuals, like your house is full of you when you're not there. I mean, that dust has you in it. So it's, you know, you just don't, it's not you in the sense that it's not the picture of you that you chose to put there, but it's you. I mean, there's, right? Like, as we know, most of the dust in our house is us, so in us. So, yeah, I don't know if that answers your question or not, but maybe
a final question from Seth.
Yeah. Hi. My question was specifically for Jorge. I was wondering, with the latex that you use in your process, is that biological latex or is it synthetic? And if it's biological, well, either way, is there a sort of relationship in terms of the decay over time of what the actual transfer medium is that is a part of the work or something that you've considered?
Yeah. It's interesting because I started using latex because I was looking for a way to get the dust off the wall. I wasn't looking for latex. And of course I was influenced by a number of artists, like Eeva-Liisa, who had used latex, and Eeva-Liisa, who had dealt with cleaning and care and so on. But the latex I chose was being developed for conservation purposes as a pure, natural latex, so filtered, very stable. And the thing with the latex is the sap of a tree, and I wasn't at the time thinking so much about the history of latex, but I've come to really think about that over time. Where does it come from? How does it? Where was it planted? It comes from the Amazon, and so on and so forth. It has a very complicated history. The thing with latex is that it decays rather rapidly, so it needs some kind of stabilizing agent. And one of the things that they used was ammonia to stabilize the latex, which is something that is not great because it smells really bad. So we started working on different ways to stabilize the latex without the ammonia, and that's a chemical company in Europe, and that would be inert enough so it doesn't decay the latex afterwards. But essentially, the latex is like paper. So if you treat it like paper, it will last for a very long time. So if you don't expose it to sunlight, if you have a stable, climate, like you put it in Beinecke library, it'll last forever. But if you put it outside, it'll decay like a piece of paper rather rapidly. So but that materiality has become more and more interesting to me, the latex itself. And the story of getting latex is very problematic. It's but of course every car, the vulcanization of latex with sulfur, is another stabilizing agent which turns it black and becomes your tires. That's a whole other story,
I just want to say that it's incredible to be spending some days with shapers of times and shaping the time and thinking about time, because it's so important not to feel lonely in this world.
Thank you. That's a wonderful note to end on. And with that, we will now break for lunch and reconvene at 1 p.m. for our second panel, Histories of Time. Thank you again to our speakers for a wonderful session.